Welcome everyone to this session on inclusive leadership. My name is Zanna Ekeroth, my pronouns are she, her, and I am working as a DEI practitioner for the 5030 project together with Women's Economic Council. I am born and raised in Sweden and moved over to Canada almost 5 years ago. Today I live on the stolen lands of the Syilx people in a small town called Naramata, just by the Okanagan Lake, which is where I took this picture. And I wanted to start the session by recognizing this land that I live, work, and learn on, and where I'm recording the session today. And I'll do that by sharing a story about my own learning. So when I moved here to the Okanagan, one of the very few things that I knew about this place was that Okanagan Lake was home to the Ogopogo monster. But what I didn't know at the time is that Ogopogo is a colonized and distorted take on a sacred story that is stolen by the Syilx people. His name isn't Ogopogo, his name is Ekeroth. He isn't a monster to fear, but a sacred being of the water that teaches us to take care of the water so that the water can take care of us. Ekeroth is deeply rooted in Syilx culture and indigenous oral storytelling. But the early settlers, when they came here, they took that story and reformed it into a monster to fear and something that could be monetized. Ferry companies in the 50s even had Ogopogo guards on board to make people feel safe on the ferry. And in the 80s, a tourist company announced that they would pay $1 million to somebody that would catch or prove the existence of the monster. So a story that starts with the sacred spirit of the water, basically to remind people of reciprocity with the land, was through colonization turned into a demon to fear and hunt, or a funny creature that can be commercialized and sold as stuffies in the souvenir shops. So learning about Ekeroth for me has helped me reflect on whose stories are being told and which worldviews are being prioritized. I'm hopeful that if we call him by his real name, Ekeroth, and if we highlight the teachings of Ekeroth instead of the fear-invoking and commercialized take, the story about Ogopogo, I think they'll help us both lean into community care and also understand the interconnectedness of the health of the people and the health of the land. So with that, I hope that this story has intrigued some curiosity for all of you to do some of your own research on the land that you are on, that you're taking this training from, learning the real names of the things that you see and explore and love, and seeking out stories outside of the colonial narrative. And with that, let's look at the learning objectives for today. We're going to start looking at what inclusive leadership is and how to lead inward and outward. And this includes moving from intention to impact, and we have a framework called Bridge to help us guide that. After that, we'll look at positionality, privilege, and power, and reflect on how it relates to our own work and our leadership style. And after that, my colleague Litzy will take over and guide us through the basics of cultural intelligence and how to build and practice it by the use of 2 different models. But first, I wanted to give you all a moment to reflect on what inclusion means to you. And I'm using Ruchika Tolshian's quote here to maybe dive a little deeper. So it says, the why of inclusion is a largely unaccepted fact. What isn't largely understood or accepted is the how. So I'm hoping that with that, we can try and not stop at it's important that everyone feels welcome, but go further and think, how can we do this? How does it feel when we are truly included into a setting? How can I help cultivate a space for everyone to feel that belonging? So I'll leave that to you, everyone who's taking this training, to reflect on how would you describe the how of inclusion. And if you'd like, you can pause the video here to take some time to write down your thoughts or do some doodling. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier. When we're looking at inclusive leadership, it encompasses behaviors both for within ourselves, so looking inwards, and also how we interact with others, how we're leading outwards. The learnings on this slide is borrowed from Catalyst, and they identified the three main core behaviors when it comes to leading inwards. The first one is curiosity. So your drive for growth comes from a perspective of wanting to learn, wanting to understand, and wanting to hear new perspectives. So with that, curiosity helps us unleash our potential to unlearn and learn. The second core behavior here is humility, accepting where you're at and being humble to the idea that you don't sit on all the answers, and that's okay. Um, it can be uncomfortable at times because it goes against the white dominant narrative of like one right way or my way or no way. But being a truly inclusive leader means being okay to say, I don't know. And maybe understanding that you have to ask somebody else to guide you in the learnings. The third core behavior, courage. This acknowledge that we will have to be brave to attempt discussions around some difficult topics. We have to be brave to address biases within ourselves and to challenge the status quo. And in some cases, that might mean to give up some of our own comfort in the journey so that we can truly become inclusive leaders. Leading outwards is speaking, is basically our actions and behaviors and how we show up for others. And in accountability is an integral piece here. This is the responsibility to answer for our own actions and the impact that they have. And it also means following through on commitments. And next module, we will actually dive deep into accountability practices and explore two different frameworks for that. So there will be good opportunity to learn more about that in the next session. Looking at the next core behavior here, ownership. And here it refers to guiding team members to solve their own problems and make their own decisions. So like giving autonomy and being there for support and guidance while not taking away somebody's creativity on how to take on or solve the task. The third one being allyship. And here it's important to note that an ally is not an identity, it's a verb. It's something that requires action. Action could be interrupting biased behavior, amplifying voices of those that are less heard, defending somebody who is being unfairly criticized. And all of these actions of allyship is especially important for leaders who hold a lot of privilege and power in their own identities. Okay. Well, something that is critical in this work is that our actions have meaningful impact, that it goes beyond good intention. So we're using Rajika Tolshan's framework here called Bridge that will help us grow as inclusive leaders, and particularly looking at how we can move from intention to impact. So B here is be uncomfortable. Doing this work isn't always comfortable. In fact, if we don't allow ourselves to be uncomfortable in this work, we won't be able to address and understand the biases within ourselves. So this might sound like, I don't have all the answers, but I'm learning, or asking somebody about what happened and saying, this is hard to hear, but I want to hear it. The R here stands for reflect. And here it's important that you audit whose perspectives that you don't have in your life. Audit the voices you hear from and you don't hear from, and take the time to reflect and understand what might be missing, what perspectives might be missing. What are my assumptions and how have they been formed by my social identities? And what are the perspectives that I don't have? The I stands for invite feedback. Seeking open and candid feedback on how to create a culture of inclusion in a team. And before making any types of decisions, doing your best to seek out the perspectives that you don't sit on yourself. So thinking about what are the perspectives that I don't have in making this decision, and ask somebody, will you tell me how I can do better? I won't interrupt. D here stands for defensiveness won't help. You have to lay down your defenses to be inclusive, and this takes practice. But think about that if somebody takes the time to believe in your ability to do better and call you into a conversation, they see that there is potential for you to grow, and that is a really good opportunity to take. So see that as an invitation to learn. And what it can sound like is, I acknowledge that what I said was hurtful. I am sorry for my behavior, and I promise to do better in the future. The G here stands for grow from mistakes. And I think it's important to point out that failure and growth often comes hand in hand, and that we don't want shame or guilt to hinder us from becoming better and more inclusive leaders. So ask yourself, what is the lesson I need to learn here? What do I need to address within myself to do better? And the last one here, E, expect changes take time. In our dominant culture, decisions tend to be made quickly, and things are often not allowed to take the time that they might need or deserve. That's called action bias, like rushing to make a change without taking the time to reflect on what meaningful change should look like. And such immediate, uninformed action might actually work completely against true DEI work, even if it comes with good intention. So understanding that we will make mistakes in our journey to become more inclusive leaders, but not letting that shame or fear stand in the way of doing this work is really important. And with saying that changes take time, that is not to say that we should just sit around and wait. It's more of a reminder for us to stay steadfast and keep working on it, even if we don't see the exact results we want to see immediately. And with that, I wanted to talk a little bit about positionality and power. Positionality is shaped by social identities such as race, sex, gender, ability, religion, nationality, and more, and statuses. Sorry, that could be education level, income level, immigrant status, and so on. And our positionality informs our privilege, the oppression that we experience, and our access to power within current systems. So reflecting on what identities that you hold, how they shape your own experiences within the workplace, and also how it informs your access to power, it really lays an important foundation for leading this work towards inclusivity. And the wheel of power here that you see to the right can help guide these reflections and help us understand how much power is granted through our own social identities. And here, the closer to the center that you are, the more power is accessed. We'll get back to this circle shortly. Sorry, there we go. So first, I just want to talk about intersectionality. It is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, and it was first used to explain the layers of oppression experienced by Black women due to intersecting identities of race and gender. And intersectionality is a framework to understand the ways that multiple forms of identities and inequalities sometimes compound themselves and create obstacles that are not understood if only looking at one dimension at a time. With that, we want to invite you to do a little bit of your own positionality reflection. And we will use Sylvia Duckworth's Wheel of Power and Privilege here as a visual representation that can guide our reflections and help us start thinking about who has power, who gets the benefit of the doubt, who doesn't, who is automatically included in groups, and who isn't. And how does all of that relate to my own positionality and my own position as a leader, for example. So with that, we invite you to grab a pen and paper or however you want to note this down and get curious about these questions. What identities have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself and the world? And here we invite you to mark where you land with dots in the Wheel of Power and Privilege that might help inform that question. And then moving on to how does your power and privilege shape your role and the work that you do? And how does your positionality and lived experiences inform your leadership style? And with leadership style here, I just wanted to say we're all leaders in different ways at work and in our personal lives. So we don't necessarily mean a title or authority, like no need to be in a manager position to reflect on that question. It's relevant to all of us. So with that, I will leave you to dive into this reflection activity. And after that, Litzy will take over and dive into culturally intelligent leadership. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of this module.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had an opportunity to reflect on the past activity. My name is Litzy Baeza. I use the pronouns she and her. I live in Treaty 6 territory located in Edmonton, Alberta, and I am the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Adult Education Specialist at the Women's Economic Council. This section or this part of the session really focuses on the trait of cultural intelligence when it comes to inclusive leadership. In this space to advance equity and inclusion, there's been lots of work done or lots of research done on some of those important traits that are necessary for inclusive leadership. In fact, Deloitte and Touche did a study back in 2019, and they identified 6 important traits for inclusive leadership, one of them being cultural intelligence. So let's take a look at what cultural intelligence is, how you can foster it. We're also going to be introducing another tool, the Sum Things Up cycle, which really looks at your intercultural competency linked as well to inclusive leadership. A lot of times when I talk about cultural intelligence, I like to bring up the cultural or the iceberg in relation to culture. And a lot of times the reason that there is this link or connection is because 80% of an iceberg is hidden. So it's not easy to see. And that's how a lot of interculturalists and a lot of folks that study culture or intercultural communication relate back to this cultural iceberg. 20% of an iceberg is visible and is easy to see. And those are the things that we focus on a lot of times, particularly when, we go abroad to another culture or we work with folks that are different than us. We usually see just the surface level. But some of the things that are really important to consider are things like values, beliefs, the way folks feel about family, the way that people communicate, gender roles, attitudes about what's good, what's bad, attitude towards marriage, attitude towards death, thought patterns. All of these things are not easy to see. And we usually call it the the hidden part of the cultural iceberg. And what cultural intelligence does is it really taps into that 80%. A lot of focus over the years has been on emotional intelligence. And while emotional intelligence is the skill that really allows folks to identify those needs, those wants, those emotions that people might have, I really do feel that emotional intelligence is culturally conditioned. It's a very dominant cultural concept. For example, you can't necessarily understand the way Japanese might interpret silence, for example. That's a very, cultural part of their communication, and silence is welcomed. It's a form of respect, right? As Canadians, we usually get uncomfortable with silence. What do you do when you're in the elevator, for example, and everyone's silent? You usually start talking about the weather or any type of sports that's been on TV or whatnot. So I really feel like cultural intelligence is that key trait or that key skill that really focuses on identifying, what are folks' values? What are some of the ways that they think about what's good, what's bad, etc. So cultural intelligence, as identified or as defined by Dr. David Livermore, who's an American researcher, and he's done a lot of work around cultural intelligence, has written a lot of books on cultural intelligence. And in fact, he developed and created a Cultural Intelligence Institute in the United States that really focuses on working with organizations to advance cultural intelligence. Is the capability to function effectively across various cultural contexts. Highly inclusive leaders are confident and effective in cross-cultural interactions. The ability to function effectively in different cultural settings is more than just having a mental map of different cultural frameworks. For example, there's lots of cultural dimension frameworks out there, Gert Hofstede being one of them, that gives you a really good idea of the generalities of value systems across cultures. So while an understanding of cultural similarities and differences is important, inclusive leaders also recognize how their own culture impacts their personal worldview, as well as how cultural stereotypes can influence their expectations of others. At a deeper level, inclusive leaders' thirst for learning means that they are also motivated to deepen their cultural understanding and to learn from the experience of working in an unfamiliar environment. When we're working with diverse others, is particularly now in this current context, it's an unfamiliar environment for a lot of us, right? Some of these topics might make us very uncomfortable. It might be harmful for some people, it might be traumatic, whatnot. So it's really important that we deepen, right, our understanding of people. And value cultural differences, right? Defy those ethnocentric tendencies that cause people to judge other cultures as inferior to their own, and enable them to build stronger connections with people from different backgrounds. That's an important piece, right? To working with diverse others is really diversifying your networks and getting those diverse perspectives, right? So again, cultural intelligence is that key skill that can really help with that. Another thing about cultural intelligence is that this trait really allows you to be tolerant of ambiguity, right? It helps to manage the stress that might be imposed by these new or different cultural environments, as well as situations where, where familiar environmental or behavioral cues are lacking, right? It's a skill that you can really tap into to changing your verbal and your nonverbal communication. In one of the sessions where we talk about communication, we're really going to be talking about some of those verbal and nonverbal behaviors that are really important to consider, particularly across cultures. All right, so there are different frameworks when it comes to cultural intelligence. Dr. David Livermore, who I just mentioned, the American researcher, has a really good model. It's called the 4-quadrant model. And it's really interesting, actually, because when you look at all these models, they're very similar to be honest with you. And we're going to go through this one. This one's called the ABCD of cultural intelligence. We're going to go through all of them, but really very similar in what they're trying to achieve. So the first part is about acquiring knowledge. There's also got to be an interest or motivation to acquire that knowledge. So that's very important. In any cross-cultural interaction or interaction with diverse others, you really need to have that interest and motivation to be able to, encounter those interactions. An important part of that is acquiring, again, that knowledge, right? It helps you identify cultural elements that might be at play, how cultures are created, how they're interpreted, how they're shared, as well as how it can impact behaviors and attitudes. So a lot of times this acquiring knowledge is about that 80% of that iceberg, right? It's about diving deeper and really looking at how do people interpret different things, right? How are cultures created? How do people symbolize things? How are they shared, etc. So it might mean you doing a bit of research, attending some of these courses. There's a lot more courses that are happening around cultural intelligence, but really diving deeper, right? Doing the research. Again, you need to have that interest and motivation to be able to do that. B is about building your strategic thinking. And this is really leading into this metacognitive step that helps you think about or make sense of that acquired knowledge. And then you use it in a way that helps you better interact with different people. So here, you really need to put some type of strategy and plan in play. So, you come across or you encounter an intercultural interaction, right? You need to acquire some knowledge about that intercultural interaction. It might be something in the workplace that you're dealing with. And then you need to build a strategy, right? What is your strategy? What are you going to do about the situation? Maybe it involves adjusting your nonverbal behaviors, right? For me, I use a lot of gestures. And sometimes I can be very distractive to other folks. So sometimes I need to lean into that and adjust, right? And think a little bit about how I might do that, right? C is contemplating your motivation and your ability to work with others, right? Here, you're really taking a step back and you're listening carefully, right? You're suspending your judgments and your biases, right? Sometimes that involves reflecting. It might mean creating a matrix for yourself. It might mean writing in a journal, right? But in order for you to really tap into what are your biases or what are some of the assumptions that might be at play, you really need to do a writing type of activity, a writing type of exercise. Or for me personally, I always use, I wasn't expecting that type of reaction, right? What's going on here? Let me stop and think about this, right? And understanding as well that your biases or your stereotypes or your assumptions that might be at play might be, right, against whatever cultural interaction might be taking place. So here it's really about awareness and mindfulness. And then finally, adapting and performing, doing, right? This step refers to your adaptability and ability to perform new behaviors based on new cultural surroundings. Are you aware of how others see you and how you come across to them? How do you interpret what others say and how do you respond? So we talked a little bit about positionality, right? In the past, in the session, in the past slides. And this is really, right, taking that step forward. It's about understanding how you come across. Where is your power? Where is your privilege, right? How does it come across in your interactions? Do you overspeak? Or do you over speak over people is what I'm trying to get at. That's just an example. Stopping, right? Adapting your nonverbal behaviors. Maybe it's, changing something about the way that you communicate, right? Maybe changing your language. Maybe it should be more inclusive. Whatever the case may be, here you're really adapting, right? And you're readapting. You're looking at a different way, perhaps, of doing things and performing that task, right? This might be things that come at different stages. So don't think of this as linear, because it doesn't necessarily mean it's linear. You could be past the acquired knowledge, for example, in an intercultural interaction. You might have the sufficient knowledge about that particular cultural interaction, and you're at B, C, and D, or you might be at C and then moving towards D. Whatever the case may be, this is just a good model for you to stop and pause, particularly when it comes to working with diverse others or those that come from different cultural backgrounds. All right, the next model that we're going to look at, and this one is a really great one. It was created here actually in Edmonton at Norquest College. Norquest College is an institute here in Alberta that's really known for advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion, and particularly intercultural competency. So Norquest College came up with this model. It's called the Something's Up model. And this is really an intercultural competence development process and mindfulness practice, right? So intercultural competency, again, is very similar to cultural intelligence, right? It's the ability to work effectively or be competent when working with diverse others or folks that come from different cultural backgrounds, right? It's the ability to really stop and understand that you might be in front of a cultural interaction. It helps you develop intercultural sensitivity, which leads to intercultural competence. It encourages you to reflect on the ways that culture might impact understanding in intercultural spaces and can be applied in an anticipatory manner or to respond to a situation, and with practice can become available in the moment. So it can become reflexive, right? I love using these types of models, particularly when I come across situations that might be different for me, or maybe I'm feeling uncomfortable. This can particularly happen when you're working with folks that come from different cultures, right? Because it's something that might make you or bring you out of your comfort zone. That's why a lot of folks, or not a lot of folks, but when people go abroad, it's really important to have intercultural training, because you can really suffer from cultural shock, right? And that's the inability to really, or the frustration and the inability to really understand the environment that you're in, right? Or to adapt to that environment. So let's go through this model. The first thing that happens here is that there's signs that something is up, right? I kind of talked about it a little bit just before this, where, you're feeling threatened, you're feeling overwhelmed, you might feel frustrated. Maybe you're in a different culture and you're feeling the need to hang on to something familiar, right? Thinking everything is fine when another person is distressed, upset, or frustrated, right? It could be the other side too. A lot of times other people can get frustrated because the communication is just not going the way that they're used to, right? Or you're feeling confused, right? Here, it's really great to ask you questions like, what is happening, right? What is happening in front of me? What kind of interaction is this? How am I feeling, right? Grounding yourself with, how am I feeling? Maybe I need to take a deeper breath. Maybe I need to step away from the situation, but how do I feel, right? And how might others feel? Right. A lot of times I think we get so wrapped up in how we feel, right? That's another dominant cultural narrative trait, the individualistic thinking, or the way of thinking of myself only, and not thinking of the collective group. So it's really also really important to consider how others might feel, right? How am I coming across? Or maybe that person is frustrated too, right? The second part of the Something's Up model is really attending to and suspending judgment. And this is very difficult for us to do. Usually when we're in front of a situation, we jump to interpretations right away. I love to use a model called the Otis model, ODIS. And Otis stands for observing, describing, interpretation, and suspending judgment. And so really it asks you to focus on observing and describing situations, especially when it's something that is unfamiliar to you, right? Before you jump to the interpretation. So when identifying a judgment, consider these categories of conclusion that you may be coming to. Credibility. That person doesn't seem credible, leadership ability. That person is not a good leader. Fairness. That's not fair. Ethics. That's not ethical. Competence. That person doesn't seem competent. Trust. I'm not sure I can trust this person. Promotability, this person doesn't have leadership potential. So these are all things, right, that could be where you might be jumping to conclusions or assumptions or judgments about something, right? Here is a great exercise to do in a journal, right? Or maybe you have a matrix that you've developed for yourself, but really asking yourself, what are your judgments? What are your biases? Are there any biases at play? What are your assumptions that you might be making, right? What do your judgments or your biases or your assumptions tell you about what is important to yourself? And what conclusions might you be making based on all of these assumptions? So here it's really important, right, to immediately attend to and suspend judgment. And a lot of times suspending judgment is an important piece of these intercultural competency models, right? It's really asking yourself, okay, am I jumping to a conclusion here, right, that I shouldn't be? Acting from stage 1 to 2 of the cycles is a reaction and may result in less than ideal outcomes. So that's why, again, it's really important to ask yourself these immediate questions, right? What are my biases? What are my assumptions? Maybe writing it down, right? And identifying quickly what is going on. Why am I feeling this way? Why am I feeling uncomfortable? Number 3 really is about making sense, right, of what's going on in 4 steps. What is the situation? What is the misunderstanding about? What is going on, right? What did I expect? What is my normal versus what did the other person expect? What is their normal? We all experience the world differently, right? Based on our value systems, based on how we see the world, based on our cultural references. So it's really important to ask yourself, what is your normal, right? Versus what is the normal of someone else? That is a question I ask myself all the time. Am I acting from what is normal in this dominant cultural narrative, this westernized culture, or what is normal in another culture, right? Or in this intercultural interaction that I might be having. Seeking commonality and acknowledging the value in different perspectives, as well as the influence of context on behavior. So how are your expectations similar? How are they different? What contextual variables may be influencing this incident? Historical injustice, transition, stress, mental health, mental illness, energy. Look at what you said about your normal and reflect on how it relates to your cultural background as well, right? Through this activity of positionality and really identifying or really focusing on your social location, or what identities have more power or privilege, right, within your context, you can really identify what is normal for you, what is valuable for you, right? What are your values? What is important? And you can reflect back to your own cultural background. Can you see anything that seems to align with your normal? So when we talk here about different cultural backgrounds, we can also talk about value orientations, cultural value orientations. And these are specific frameworks, right, that look at generalities of value systems across cultures. There are some good ones, Gert Hofstede being one of them. Gert Hofstede has a great website called Hofstede Insights, where you can go and compare different countries, actually different cultures. So if you're someone who's working across cultures and you really want to understand, for example, hey, I'm communicating a lot with someone from Japan. I really want to understand how they view power, how they view uncertainty, etc. You can look at those different values through this app, Hofstede Insights Country Comparison. So anyways, this really helps you identify, again, what is your normal versus what might be the normal of someone else, right? You're looking at these maybe cultural value orientations. Oh, okay, they view power very differently than I do, right? They view seniority very different than I do. So it's understanding, it's that deeper cultural knowledge, right, that we looked at through the cultural intelligence model. The fourth stage is about informed action. It's about preparing to respond to a situation. It's about strategy, right? We looked at that in the cultural intelligence model. Informed action implies that different perspectives have been considered and the best response possible has emerged. Here you can ask yourself, what action can I take personally? Is there something that I need to do differently? Interpersonal, is there something that needs resolution at the group or the interpersonal level, right? Maybe it's a team dynamic. A lot of times in my work as an intercultural specialist, I get called into organizations that, for example, you have the Mexicans who might not be working effectively with the German side, right? So how do we resolve that, right, at that group level? We need to have a shared understanding, right? The Mexicans need to understand why it's important for the Germans to be on time, for example, at a meeting, or why it's important to have more of a direct communication pattern. So there might need to be a resolution more at a team, more of a collective level, right? Systems, is there something that needs to be reviewed? Is there a policy that needs to be looked at? I really love this idea of the systems review because as we know, equity can only be worked through systems change. And it really considers that deeper look, right? That systemic change. What do we need to change within systems, processes, procedures, projects, right? What needs to change to make sure that it's equitable and it's culturally relevant in this situation? All right, and then the middle circle. So we went through the four stages, but the middle circle is really about identifying goals, right? Kind of after you've gone through the situation, this kind of something's up cycle within an interaction or within a process or whatever the case may be. The final stage really is about identifying goals and their progress indicators that are important to you, right? Individually, this has to do with change that you seek personally, like greater understanding, self-awareness. Maybe it's something within your communication style that you're eager to change, right? And it's about you having a greater self-awareness of how that can happen. And a lot of times, maybe that means, writing it down, right? Or having it somewhere where it's visible to you. Whatever the case, it's about being more mindful. It's about being more self-aware. From a group perspective, right? That shared understanding to increase the effectiveness of team dynamics, right? We want to ensure that the team has an understanding of what's going on, how it's being resolved. Maybe it's about doing more professional development, right, around some of these topics. Action. Here, we're developing a feedback process, or you're creating an orientation session, or you're facilitating learning, whatever the case may be, you're doing something, right? Maybe it's those professional development courses. Maybe it's working through the something's up cycle, right? Individually. Maybe it's working through the cultural intelligence model individually. Maybe it's coming up with a matrix. There's lots of different things that you can do to action, right? What your goals might be. And then changing system structures or processes. I always say that everyone has the power to make change. Sometimes we might not have that authoritative power, that senior manager leadership title, but we all have power within our roles to make change within systems, within processes, within structures. And so I love this, right? I think it's important that, especially if you're working within an organization or you're interested in advancing equity and inclusion and intercultural communication and diversity, it's really important that you make the change within your role. All right, so we're going to, that really comes to the end of our session on cultural intelligence and intercultural competency and the importance of it, right, for inclusive leadership. So this is your opportunity to really stop here and to think about the something's up model or the ABCD of the cultural intelligence model. And we invite you to write your own goals related to these two ideas, right? And inclusive leadership as well. We went through the first part that really looked at what does inclusive leadership look like. So your goals may be individual, they may be interpersonal, they may be systems based, right? They could involve acquiring knowledge. It can involve building strategic thinking and making sense of knowledge. It might be contemplating your assumptions, your motivations, or doing, right? Walking the talk. So take a few minutes, pause the video here and take a few minutes as we close out this session to define 2 or 3 goals related to inclusive leadership, cultural intelligence, intercultural competency. I will know I have made progress on this goal when, again, take a few minutes to think about everything that you've looked at today. Pause this video and work through this activity. Thank you again. And I really look forward to continuing with you on this learning journey.